Welcome to WitchLit, a podcast where we talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, fiction author, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Kelden has been practicing traditional witchcraft for more than a decade. He is the author of The Crooked Path, an introduction to traditional witchcraft. Additionally, his writing has appeared in The Witch's Altar, The New Aradia, A Witch's Handbook to Magical Resistance, and This Witch magazine. Kelden is also the creator of the Traditional Witches deck, and he authors a blog on the Patheos Pagan channel called By Athame and Stang. In his free time, Kelden enjoys reading, hiking, growing poisonous plants, and playing ukulele. And we will definitely have to get to that ukulele part. Kelden, welcome to WitchLit.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about writing and research and your book and ukulele playing.
Yes.
Great. So our first question for everybody is, why write?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, I love writing. Growing up, I learned kind of the joys of writing through my older sister. Growing up, she was always writing stories, and I kind of just started copying her. So I would start writing stories, and it was also a way to, I think, to help expand my imagination. And in a way, it's sort of an escapism, right? You kind of put yourself in these stories. And as I got older and I started getting interested more, especially into like the history of witchcraft, I wanted to share what I was finding, and also just finding a place to kind of mind dump all of the things that I was learning, finding a way to organize it outside of my own head. That's sort of the crux of why write for me, is just sharing this information, especially information that maybe people aren't normally being exposed to or finding.
Mm-hmm. So what was your writing journey to getting published like? I mean, did you, obviously you started writing when you were pretty young, but what did like finally like, oh, I'm going to put my writing out into the world look like for you?
So I started a blog back when I was still an undergrad. So this was 6 years, maybe more ago. I don't know math.
And what is time? What is time during a pandemic?
I know. So I started writing this blog, and I was greatly inspired by other bloggers that I was reading at the time. And it was just a way for me to initially start getting some of my ideas out there. And eventually I met Jason Mankey, and he got me started at Patheos. So my blog sort of became a bigger space on a bigger platform. And from there, I was writing for several years. And then again, Jason Mankey sort of approached me and was like, when are you going to write a book? Like, all of the other bloggers here at Patheos are writing books. Like, now it's your turn. And I was kind of like, oh God, I don't know. Like, I honestly had never really given much thought to like writing a book. But it was after he said that I don't know, like these pieces just started to click into my mind of like, this is what I would write about. This is how I would write it. This is why I would write it. And so I realized that I wanted to approach Llewellyn. And I went through their process. So their process, you start by submitting, a bunch of different kind of answers to like questions of like, who are you? Like, why are you the one to write this book? That kind of stuff. And they also require like 3 sample chapters. So that got me already kind of writing this first book, which would become The Crooked Path. And so I submitted all of that and they were like, yeah, let's do it. And that's really the starting point where it all began.
And then things have kind of fed on that. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think, I don't know, blogging seems like it has been like a gateway drug to writing for a lot of people. It's just one of those ways that people get started and I think get noticed too. I mean, I don't know that we're still in the golden age of blogging, but I still think it happens that way a lot for some people.
Yes, definitely. I would definitely agree with that.
So now that you're published and publishing, how much of your life is writing, day job, other things you do to pay the bills? Like, do you introduce yourself as a writer first? Like, where is writing? Like, what percentage of your life is writing now?
Writing is, honestly, I would say it's maybe number 3 in the sort of hierarchy of my life. I mean, writing is not my day job. My day job is a mental health therapist. So that's really like the big chunk of my time is spent within my specific career field. And so writing is something that I would describe for me as being more of a hobby or a passion project versus a career. So it's always there. I'm always working on something, but I would rank it as number 3. Number 2 would just, of course, just be my other hobbies and my spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say like your goal is for your writing? I mean, even as a passion project, I assume you still have like some mountains you'd like to climb with that. So what would that look like? What are the next goals, I guess?
My next goals are really to find different ways of sharing information, specifically kind of looking at exploring the realms of fiction as a traditional witch, being very inspired by folklore and seeing the ways that we really learn a lot through folklore. I think it's interesting to look at the ways we can generate sort of new pieces of folklore through folk tales and rhymes to convey certain lessons and messages, while still having it be kind of within this creative fiction, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really kind of my next goal, is to sort of explore those realms. Also just for myself, I mean, I spend a lot of time kind of within the realm of nonfiction, within the realms of history. So just being able to kind of flex my more like creative writing skills.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I want to go.
Yeah, it's funny. In talking to a lot of nonfiction writers for the podcast, a lot of folks kind of are interested in kind of making that jaunt over to fiction writing too. And I think it's probably, like you said, it's almost like it's a natural progression when you've done so much research and just to tell a story, the desire to tell a story too, with the knowledge you've gained through your nonfiction writing and research. So that makes sense to me. I like that idea. And, witches are hot in fiction. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that's again kind of going back to the early childhood piece. Like that's, I mean, really like when I started writing as a kid, like I was writing stories. I wasn't writing nonfiction pieces. So it's kind of a return to my roots.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think there's even like, precedents. Like there's a lot of nonfiction writers who've written books on witchcraft and the occult who've then gone on to write fiction. And I mean, even Gerald Gardner wrote a fiction book.
Oh, right.
So like, yes, I think there's a long progression of those folks too. So while you're thinking about your fiction and nonfiction writing, so what is like a perfect like writing session, or probably in your life, it's not like a whole day to write unless it's on the weekend or something, but what does like a perfect writing session look like to you? Do you have like rituals around writing as part of your practice, or is it just like catch when you can get a chance to write?
It's a little catch while you can. I will say, like, the bulk of my writing is actually done at the small little coffee shop in my hometown. I spend a lot of time there on weekends, and weekends are when I get writing done. It's very rare that I'm doing much writing during the week, because obviously that's when I'm working my day job, and it's just exhausting when I get a moment to catch my breath during the week. It's usually like me wanting to just take a nap or sleep.
Yeah.
So writing, yes, I would say the ritual of writing is typically going to this coffee shop, getting an iced coffee, putting in my headphones, listening to some kind of spooky instrumental music, and just getting to work. Other times, if I'm at home writing, that's when I do like to, set the mood a little bit more, maybe with some candles and some incense. So I would say those are my main rituals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we moved cross country, and my coffee shop that I used to write in is now like 2,500 miles away.
Oh no!
So I haven't found my new writing location here yet, but I'm looking for it.
It's really important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been pretty consistent. Like wherever I've moved, is finding that writing location, which is typically a coffee shop, because I just love coffee so much. And so having moved back to my hometown, it's nice to kind of get back to the original writing spot.
Yeah. And do you find like writing in coffee shops, and I know you said you put headphones in, so this may not be as true for you, but do you find like that, like the weird hubbub white noise of coffee shops also helps with concentration? Like I've noticed that's a real issue for me. Is like at home, I'm a lot easier to distract than when I'm in that kind of setting with just people milling about and talking and clinking dishes.
Yeah, no, I definitely would agree with that. Home is very distracting for me. So that's why, like, if I'm writing at home, it's usually, more, it's either like right away in the morning or at the end of the day. Like those are sort of my time slots, because otherwise I find just like middays to like, there's just too many distractions.
Mm-hmm. So what was the seed for this book specifically, for The Witch's Sabbath? Because I feel like this is such an interesting topic. There's relatively new scholarship coming out, and just like I think it seems to be one of those like waves in the trends of what people are talking about in the witchcraft and pagan world. So what was the seed for you to work on this book?
The seed really is that, like, I love The Witch's Sabbath. It's such an integral part of my craft. And I also really love history and folklore. So seeing really there hasn't been a whole lot until I would say recently, like you were just saying, like there hasn't been a lot written about the Witch's Sabbath, and specifically within the realm of modern practitioners, right? A lot of the writing that's being done about the Witch's Sabbath, and specifically the history of it, is being done in very academic spaces. And those are spaces that a lot of people don't necessarily have access to. So I'm thinking about a lot of the books that I was utilizing within my research. These are pretty dense academic texts that like have really inaccessible language for most people, and are also just really expensive.
Yes.
So these aren't books that are really going to be sought out more often than not by modern practitioners. Part of that too is because we just don't know they exist. Mm-hmm. I think when we tend to look for books, we're looking in the sort of like new age or occult section. And these books aren't going to be in those sections. These books are going to be in history, anthropology, folklore sections. So they're just not being accessed or found. And so my goal was really to create a bridge between the realm of academia and modern practice. Because that's the other thing too, is in a lot of these texts that are being written about the history of the witches' Sabbath, it has a stopping point where these academics, these scholars kind of stop. They're like, okay, so like this idea was developing, it was introduced into the witch trials, it really like blew up. And then the witch trials ended, the end. But the history of the witches' Sabbath continues on in a few different ways, all the way into our modern era. And so I wanted to kind of keep that line going instead of just stopping when the witch trials stopped. And bringing this information to our community, where then we can say, oh, hey, here's this information maybe we've been missing. This is really fascinating. This is where stuff that we do comes from, and we didn't even maybe realize it.
Mm-hmm. So I looked, after reading the book, I looked through the bibliography and just kind of like what you're talking about, like a lot of those books are difficult to access. Like even I was like, I'm just going to go see what I could get through interlibrary loan. And like some of them aren't even available that way because they won't loan them because they don't come back apparently. Mm-hmm. So like it's difficult to access the books. Like you said, they're expensive. And if you can't get them on interlibrary loan, where are you going to encounter these books? But the other thing I was kind of thinking about is like you did some like like transcripts of witch trials and looked at stuff like that. And I'm just thinking like research wise, like that's got to be, even if you're looking at, modern transcriptions of the witch trial records, like it's not a fun topic to read about what happened to these people who are accused of being witches and that part. So what was the research like for you? I mean, I think it would be both fascinating and also kind of heartrending to do this research.
Mm-hmm. It was a lot. I mean, that was the biggest part of this particular project was the research process. Mm-hmm. And yeah, reading a lot of trial transcripts. You do encounter and you do read through that accounts of torture and things that these people were put through. And it's not fun. And you do put yourself in their shoes and think about, if I was in this situation, I don't want to be in this situation. This sounds really horrible and scary. And so one of the things that I really make a point to do is to honor these people. I mean, we know that these people, by and large, were innocent. I mean, they weren't doing these things that they were confessing to, but yet the folklore that they utilized in their confessions, the folklore that those confessions then further generated, those have direct impacts on the practice of modern craft. And so I think it's important that we honor these people for, really the ways that they've impacted our craft. So it was really difficult to read, to sift through these accounts and these stories of people, because that's the thing, is these are people. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, they are stories, but they are also people. So yeah, it was really difficult.
So I guess one of the things that fascinates me about this kind of research is, once you get to the part where you can access, this information, and thankfully with the internet and all that, it's a lot easier to do now than even 15 or 20 years ago, because a lot of stuff has been brought online. So that's good. But like, it seems like because this is such a big topic across so many countries, across multiple continents, like how did you kind of zone in on what to focus on? Because I could imagine you could just spend your life researching this topic and never write a book. So how do you figure out how did you figure out like what to focus on and what to what channel to stay in to write the book? given the information that's out there.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really wanted to do with this book was to look at the way that the concept of the Sabbath appeared in many different countries. And so when it came to sort of zoning in or like the parameters around what I was going to talk about, I knew that I wanted to focus on specifically European countries. I mean, like witchcraft itself is a European construct, and it's also the spaces within, you know, where my ancestry comes from. So I knew that I didn't want to talk about places where, you know, maybe Sabbath ideas were sort of brought in by colonizers, because the thing, like, there are pieces of folklore from different areas, from different countries that I think we could retroactively, or even, you know, or they were, again, through colonization, sort of labeled as witchcraft or being, you know, akin to the witch's Sabbath. I just didn't want to participate in that. So I knew that, you know, geographically, this is the region that I wanted to stick with. And so then it just came to looking at, like, what countries did this concept pop up in? And there were a lot of limitations in terms of language barrier and lack of resources. So there are some countries where documentation regarding the witch trials really hasn't been translated into English. And so those were places that unfortunately I wasn't able to write about. Or there were places where documentation or ideas about the witch's Sabbath are really scant. So there are places that, you know, could be written about eventually as more resources and materials become available, or, you know, hopefully maybe people from those places, you know, pick up the quest and write about it themselves. So I ended up with, you know, with these specific countries based on, one, did the Sabbath appear? Two, are there documents that I can access? That's really how I sort of zeroed in on which places to write about. But you're right, it is a really big topic. And the sort of curse of it is that, you know, as I continue to read history and folklore, now that the book is out, you know, I keep stumbling upon things that I'm like, God, like, this would have been really awesome to include, or like, oh my gosh, like, here's this whole new piece of information. But of course, I just remind myself that, yeah, like, that would have been nice, but also like, you could include a lot of things in there, and then this book would be, you know, several volumes.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, the nice thing about like a nonfiction work too is, you know, if like scholarship radically changes, or you know, kind of shift your perspective, like updating, you know, a new revised edition is an option. So you can always do that later with more research. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm really curious. Like, one of the things you bring up early in the book is kind of the spillover and overlap between persecution of Jewish people and persecution of witches, because basically to a lot of the accusers and the church and state, I mean, where they're interwoven, is like, witch, Jew, it doesn't matter. We're, you know, equally evil under their eyes. So the spillover, the language that gets used around like Sabbath and, you know, even iconography of witches, we know a lot of this like hooked nose, green skin, pointed hat stuff. Also, there's a lot of spillover. So, you know, how do you kind of untangle that to talk more about the witchcraft aspect of it and tease that out from like this, you know, this other ugly thing basically that was going on at the same time, and unfortunately continues in both threads to some extent. So
I would say that in some ways it's almost impossible to untease those things. I mean, the development of the witch's Sabbath narrative, as well as just the concept of the witch in general, I mean, it's like this chain reaction. It's this evolution of different things that are getting pulled into the folds of the story, in both in terms of just the concept of the witch, as well as the witch's Sabbath. Part of that along the way was the persecution of Jewish people. And so in terms of like untangling, I think it's just a matter of looking at like when in this chain reaction are the Jewish people being pulled in. And there's sort of two different points in which that happens. And it's really after Christianity becomes the dominant religion that I would say the more dramatic pull of the Jewish people into this witchcraft narrative happens. And I think that's really when, I mean, this is when we start to see the term synagogue being used quite frequently. This is also when we start to see, eventually the term Sabbath does become the sort of predominant term being used, but for a long time, it really wasn't. There were a lot of generic terms used, including synagogue, and that specific term we see after Christianity takes hold and they really start to focus in on persecuting Jewish people.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. That was one thing I had not come across before, that they had used the word synagogue kind of interchangeably with all of these different things. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, I think it's just like, I think about like kind of these modern conversations around these issues and like how we, as modern witches or modern pagans or, whatever label, we're using, how do we navigate like that terminology? Like, what's our responsibility as modern practitioners to kind of make sure that, I guess just kind of understand, like you said, understand the history, that these things are kind of linked in a way we can't 100% untangle them. So what does our responsibility become as modern practitioners to, I guess, kind of honor that and make sure we're not stepping on the same toes or worse?
Right. Absolutely. And I think one of the things, to go back to like talking about the, the people that have been accused, tortured, and executed as witches, one of the things that I think is really important is recognizing the part that these people and their confessions played in eventually the development of modern witchcraft. And I think a lot of times people want to dismiss the witch trials and trial transcripts and just be like, like those were all, given under duress, like those don't have any bearing on what we're doing today. And that's just not true. And I think ultimately it's disrespectful and it's a disservice to these people and their lives to just ignore, for the role that they played, for better or for worse.
And I think, I'll be honest, I think for a long time that was kind of, because I am older, so I kind of came into witchcraft and paganism like in the early 90s during the, the burning times concept of things. And we're like, okay, well, that had already really been disproven even before then, but we were in the middle of it. And so I think my backlash to that was, these were not witches. These were people who were tortured. There was this legacy of misogyny and bigotry and anti-Semitism and, name all of the bad isms of European culture, and had not really written it off, but just said, these were people who were persecuted wrongly, period. And so I think this, this newer scholarship about, no, they were tortured, but these stories came from somewhere. And I think having talked to another friend and colleague recently about this, just kind of getting my own thoughts around it. Like, I think one of the things is, how do you tease apart the actual folklore and what they were being fed? by the torturers. Like, how do you, and I think that happens a lot in the more academic scholarship, but like for you writing, like, how do you tease that apart? Like, this is, these narratives are similar because, they're all influenced by, the Malleus Maleficarum, or they were all using these same questions versus this is the actual folklore that they recalled during these unfortunate sessions, or, sometimes not under torture. So,
right. Some of the ways that I think we can do that work is by just sort of understanding like what was going on in, in a specific region during that time. So thinking about like, okay, like if we're talking about a series of witch trials happening in this specific part of Germany at this specific time, like what are the texts, like what are texts that maybe would have been circulating at the time? Were there any texts? Were there other witch trials happening nearby where so people are getting these ideas circulating, whether that's from reading these materials or from hearing by word of mouth about other witch trials. Also by reading, you can find specific transcripts, right, where they're talking about like accused, and then interrogator, and you kind of see that like sort of interview format of like question and answer. You can really look into those, and with the caveat that, a lot of times those aren't being recorded verbatim, sometimes very intentionally so. But you can start to recognize patterns of when interrogators are asking leading questions or when they are sort of feeding answers. So like, if the accused is saying, oh, I met with, the fairy queen, and then the interrogator's like, so you met with the devil. And then, and then the accused says, yeah, I met with the devil. Like you kind of see this, right, this process unfolding. And I think those are the places where we can start to pull things apart. We can start to say, okay, well, this idea was circulating at the time, or within confessional materials, we see these like little pieces that are, that I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for, but like they're sort of anomalies, like they don't really match with everything else. And those are the things that I think are really interesting to kind of poke at and say, what is this? Like, what is this that, is not fitting with the rest of it? Is this part of some pre-existing folklore that's maybe demonized?
Yeah. I know, it's just, I mean, honestly, I could ask you questions for 2 hours about those, but I also want to make sure we talk about like how to bring this into modern practice. But so I guess that's my next question is like, so doing this research and putting the book together, like, how do you feel like, clearly this was already part of your practice, but now that you've done this kind of deep dive, how has that impacted your practice, and kind of what do you want readers to take away from the book into modern practice?
So there's sort of a two-pronged answer to this, and I think it could be both. It could be both, and it doesn't have to be an either or. But on one hand, even if you're somebody who's not going to incorporate the Witch's Sabbath into your practice, I think this book is important in the sense that it's giving this context and this history that often is overlooked. I think in a lot of ways within modern witchcraft, neo-paganism, Wicca, we have this idea of the Sabbats, and we have this idea of it being these sort of seasonal holidays, but we're missing a whole chunk of history. We're missing the way that idea came to be. We're also missing the way that the Witch's Sabbath also came into modern practice as an otherworldly gathering that is more sort of in tune with the original folklore. Not that one is better than the other. I don't want to suggest that. Just that I think we sort of miss this other side of it. And so I think it's just good for people to be exposed to this history, and to see, again, sort of the importance of things like folklore, like the witch trials, and how that really does have a big impact on what we do today, whether we realize it or not. The other prong to it is, yeah, for people to see that there's this really fascinating set of practices regarding spirit flight, crossing into the other worlds, going to this otherworldly meeting of spirits and witches, and all of the really wonderful things that you can do there. And so if people are interested in that, this book helps give them the tools necessary to make that journey.
Mm-hmm. I also feel like just having, like I said, having read the book, I feel like it's, there is like, it's a closed thing in and of itself, right? Because I think your book does a good job of talking about the history and then also like modern practice and ways to access that. So, but I also think it's a jumping off point. Like I always tell people like, what's one book you would recommend for blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't ever recommend one book. That's not how my brain works. It's like, so what, I mean, like if people kind of want to build on what you've offered, like where should they go next? Like what do you, where would you see them going next to get more information or look at this more deeply or?
I would say, one place would be to read some of these historical texts for yourself. I mean, I know earlier we were talking about like they're pretty difficult to find sometimes, but the ones that I include in the specific recommended reading in the back of the book are ones that are relatively easier to find. Mm-hmm. But also there are a lot of online sources, like places like archive.org, I believe it is. Mm-hmm. Actually, archive.org. So like there are a lot of older texts that can be found online. You just have to search them out. Again, they can be really sort of difficult to read in terms of language, but if you're up for the challenge, that's awesome. In terms of like other books, one of the newer books that actually came out just a little bit before mine, A Broom at Midnight by Roger J. Horn, is an excellent book that is also talking about concepts of spirit flight, and he gives 13 really excellent different techniques for engaging in spirit flight. And so I think it's a book that pairs really well with the Witch's Sabbath. So if you want to expand on the techniques that I give and you want to explore kind of other ways of traveling in spirit, I think that's a really excellent book to read. Really, I would say just looking through the bibliography and the recommended reading. That's one of the things that I love about books, and does create this real rabbit hole, is just you read a book, you really like it, you like the topic, so then you're like, okay, now I'm going to look at what this author was reading and the sources they were looking through, and it just creates this this pathway that's, I think, really fun to follow.
Mm-hmm. I always see each book as an opportunity to find 10 more books at least.
Exactly.
And I think you did a great job of like giving people directions, like with the recommended reading and the bibliography. I think there's a lot of good info for people there. So what, like, now that the Witch's Sabbath is out in the world, what's your next project, if you can talk about that, and where can readers connect with you? And then we'll do our last question.
Yeah, so my current project is, like I said, kind of working my way into the realms of fiction and kind of looking at different ways of conveying different ideas, different methodologies of working magic and witchcraft, but sort of ensconced within metaphor and story. So there's not a whole lot of detail I can give just at this time, just because it's still sort of a nebulous project that's existing in the ether. Yeah. But something maybe to keep an eye out for. In terms of where people can find me, the primary place that people can find me is on Instagram at Kelden Mercury. I do make YouTube videos. Again, you can search for Kelden Mercury. those are kind of the two primary places where people can find me. And of course, you can read my old articles at Pathos, my blog there by Athme and Stang. I don't really post anything there anymore, but there's a backlog of older articles.
Yeah, I will make sure to put all that in the show notes too, so people can access that a little easier. So I know you know because I sent you the questions, but so the last question we do for the show is a tiny bit of a game of chance, because I am a nosy Scorpio by nature, and I like to talk about things we're not supposed to talk about, which is also kind of the whole podcast too. But so I'm going to roll a die. And it's a heavy metal one, so you'll hear it on the desk. And based on what number we get, I'm going to ask you the last question about that. Okay. And the topics are death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one. And they are tangential to writing or the writing life or being a witch or a pagan. 6, you get to pick which topic.
Oh my gosh, like. I am an indecisive Libra, so I'm going to I'm gonna choose death.
Death. Oh, okay. So funnily enough, this is the same question that Jason Menke got. So it'll be interesting to see how you two differ. So when you die, what would you like to see happen to any unfinished work or your notes? Like, do you have an idea of like where the Kelden papers reside after your death?
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely would want them to go to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. Which feels like, I'm like, I don't know, are my papers important enough? But I just think that would be really cool because I know they have quite a big archive of different books and documents. And I think it would just be really cool to have like my journals end up there. Even if nobody ever reads them, even if they just sort of like disintegrate into dust, just to know that they're like literally in that location that I think is just so magical and beloved and important. I would be very happy with that. Otherwise, I mean, I don't know, like if people would maybe like make it into a book of its own. I mean, I don't know. I think that stuff is really interesting. I like seeing other people's notes and journals. So, you know, if people wanted to see mine, then it'd be cool for them to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think what you said about is my stuff important enough? And I was like, my immediate thought was like, I don't know that we know in the moment, but I think later it can always be, you know, like someone at some point in the future is going to be researching a book about, you know, modern witchcraft practitioners in the, you know, early 20th or early 21st century. And there you go. So at some point that could become very important to someone.
That's true. And I do think about the fact that like I would, you know, like if I were to stumble upon some like deceased person's like witchcraft notes, like I would lose my mind, even if it was like really ultimately sort of boring. Like I would just love to have that and to be like, oh my gosh, this is this person's story and this is the thing we thought were important. And so you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna feel a little bit more confident in that.
Yeah, no, I think you should. I think it's, well, I just think about like research in, you know, in many other ways, like I read a lot of research about like early homemaking and recipe. I'm also very kitchen witchy, so the area I love to dig into, and like how prized like people's marginalia in their old cookbooks are, like these tiny notebooks that women kept, like, you know, their receipts and just like how precious those things are because it's on paper and it, you know, was not considered important because it was women's stuff, you know. And I think that like how precious those things are now. So I think about like what we are producing in a material form, how precious that may be later, especially since so much stuff is electronic, like those like actual archive things. What is that going to look like? So
right, absolutely.
Well, cool. Well, Kelden, thank you so much for being on the show. This was such an interesting conversation, and like I said, I feel like I could just pick your brain about your research for this book for, you know, the next year.
I could talk about it forever. So
Well, when you get your fiction book out into the world, definitely, let us know, and we'll have you back on and talk about fiction writing and how that was different.
Definitely.
Great. Well, thank you. And don't forget, everybody else, don't forget to check out links for Kelden in the show notes, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Keifel Agostini, who also designed our logo. Our music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew K. End, licensed from Pixabay. You can find transcripts and all our previous episodes at witchlitpod.com and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe and consider giving us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.